Thank you so much for having me. I have been looking forward to the Community Summit for a long time, and I'm very glad that this worked out. We've been talking about it for over a year, and so this is really cool to finally be in this room with you. My name is Gaelynn Lea, and I am a musician and a public speaker and a disability advocate, and I wanted to kind of share my story and then some thoughts about disability culture and the concept of enrichment. So first I'll just kind of introduce myself. So I am a person from Duluth, Minnesota. It's very, very, very cold there. That's the defining feature of Duluth. And the Lake Superior is right on the tip of, we're right on the tip of Lake Superior, I guess. And so I have a disability called Osteogenesis Imperfecta, or Brittle Bones Disease. And so before I was born, I broke about 30 or 40 bones, maybe 50, they don't really know, in utero. And they healed bent, and so my arms and legs are bent kind of at the joints, and they're permanently bent like that. And so they don't hurt or anything, but they were broken before I was born, they healed before I was born. So when I would, ultrasounds were so bad back then that they didn't know anything was going on until I was born, and then they discovered I had this condition. And so I've never walked. I've used an electric wheelchair since I was 2.5. I was lucky to be born when they were becoming more available, electric wheelchairs, and so I destroyed all the doorways in our house and ran over everybody I knew and stuff, learning how to drive at a very young age. But I have had independence pretty much my whole life, so and so I'm very grateful for that. So my siblings do not have a disability. I'm the only one in my family with Brittle Bones Disease, and so I had a really fun childhood. A lot of people ask me, what was it like growing up with a disability? Was it hard? Were you sad about it? And in reality, having a disability, if you have supportive parents, which I was very lucky, you know, I can only tell about my experience. I know not everybody is born into a family that is supportive and their parents are, you know, above board and helping you to do the things you need to do, but I was lucky to have a family like that, and so my childhood was really fun. I had 3 siblings, and so we would get into trouble together a lot. I remember one time in particular, my brother wanted to take all of us, my oldest brother wanted to take us all out on a bike ride, so he sat me on his newspaper rack of his bicycle and tied me up with twine. And we got in a lot of trouble for that one, actually. But in general, I wasn't left out. My siblings were really inclusive, and so I did a lot of fun things. It wasn't until I was a little bit older, because my parents had always told me as a little kid, whatever you want to do, I'm sure you'll figure out a way. If you really want to do it, you'll figure out a way to do it, right? And so I was little, and I saw an orchestra play when I was 9 years old at our school, and I was like, I want to play in the orchestra. And luckily, my parents, even though they were not sure how that was going to be possible, said, if you really want to do it, you'll figure out a way. And so I learned to play violin because I was able to talk to the orchestra teacher, and she was willing to adapt the instrument for me. So we tried all the different instruments, the cello and the violin. The cello was too big, the violin was too big up on my shoulder, but luckily I was able to, we kind of jointly thought of this idea of playing the violin up and down like a tiny cello. So I hold my bow like a bass player holds their bow, and so I've been playing violin in this adaptive way since I was 10 years old, and that was a huge deal for me. I've been playing for 25 years now, and it's all because I had a very encouraging teacher. And so, so I was lucky to have support from my parents, but also people like my teacher who decided not to put up an additional barrier, but instead she was willing to work with me so that I could learn to do something that I was really passionate about. And so I didn't learn about the barriers for people with disabilities really until I was an adult. So when I was a kid, once in a while, I would get kind of sad that I couldn't walk around and do the same things as the other kids. And then I would cry, and my mom would talk to me, and I'd feel better. And then eventually, I would just go along my merry way. And about the time I was 13, those bouts of sadness kind of stopped happening because I had kind of just accepted, like, this is who I am, and I can do a lot of things, and wheelchairs are getting better and better all the time. And so I had kind of just let that sadness go, and so I didn't really run into any barriers as a person with a disability until I got out of high school. So the first big barrier that I encountered that I think is pretty common, and we don't talk about it very often, is obvious one, right? Access to spaces, right? Transportation. Those are the main ones as you're navigating as an independent adult. But then there was a different kind of barrier that came up shortly after that, and it was medical trauma. So I had a respiratory failure, and the doctor walked in to look at me and to make his evaluation, and he saw that I looked differently, and instead of doing any tests or prescribing any medicine, he just said, well, she's small, she's going to die. And so that's what he told my parents. Luckily, because I wasn't conscious at the time, my mom was like, well, that seems odd, it's a bone disorder. I don't really like that answer. So she got a second opinion, and luckily that doctor was like, well, if it was anybody else, I would prescribe prednisone, and he's obviously done that, right? And she said, no, he hasn't done anything. And so they prescribed prednisone, and I recovered 24 hours later. So the thing is that if you have a disability, a lot of times you end up having to be, we talk about self-advocacy a lot, and I hope that when we talk about that, we are also talking about it in the medical world, because it's really important to make sure that you understand what your doctor is doing and why, and that you are advocating for yourself, or that you have somebody who really cares advocating on your behalf to make sure you're getting the right kind of care. Because in that situation, it really was quite scary, right? Not to be given the same options that anyone else would be given. And so medical trauma led to a lot of anxiety. So that was another barrier that I didn't think about. People, when they see me, my bones look different, I can't walk, and I think they assume that the disability, the challenges I faced have mostly come from my mobility issues, but in reality, anxiety and depression have been just as big of deals to me. They've been things that I've had to work really hard to not let them impact my life in a way that's so negative, even though I'll probably never completely rid myself of anxiety. It's something that I have to learn to cope and manage. And so things like that, mental health issues, we don't know what people are facing by just looking at them, right? We can make assumptions, but a lot of times our assumptions are either incorrect or they only get us part of the way there. So really getting to know the people that we're surrounding ourselves with or working with is super important. The next barrier that I started facing in adulthood was employment. So I had interviews where people would come up, I would sit down and they would say, well, now that we see you, we don't think you'll be able to do this job. Well, that's actually illegal. You can't say that. But it gets said, unfortunately, in real life. Or I would find out after an interview that I thought went really well, that when I left the room, they would talk about, well, will she scare the kids by the way she looks? And those are both real life examples of things that have happened in interviews. There was another job where I applied to be an entry-level secretary. I had a college degree. I was going to work at a chiropractic office. I ended up having 4 interviews for that job. By the 4th interview, I was like, maybe I'm secretly being vetted to be president of the United States. What is going on? So, and the thing is when I left that position a couple years later, the next person they hired, they did it in a group interview, and they hired after the first group interview. So the discrimination isn't obvious always, but it's still alive and well. And I talk about these barriers not to just hey, it's your first day of a conference, let's have a huge downer. I forgot to mention that there are things that we can do about these. So for medical trauma, you can have an advocate, you can be an advocate. For employment barriers, I think there's a lot of really cool things that are possible right now to get people with disabilities in employment, right? A lot of what you people do is actually working towards that directly, but there's also things like working from home. We have computers, we can do a lot of our jobs from home so that people with chronic illness or people who can't reliably get to work every day can still be active participants in the workplace. What I ended up doing after working many years in regular $10 an hour jobs where I couldn't seem to get any farther than that, is I ended up teaching fiddle lessons. I started my own business basically, and so I had about 15 students. I could set my own hours, and it was a really fun chapter in my life, and it was very empowering to be able to make a schedule that really worked with my situation, right? Like I could figure out transportation times that worked. I could go to the doctor if I needed to. And so I learned while I was teaching that actually people with disabilities are twice as likely to be self-employed than people without. So if you are working with folks with disabilities and they're talking about wanting to start a business, another thing that you can do instead of putting up a barrier is to be supportive and try to help think about how that might actually be feasible, because in some ways it can be a really empowering experience. So the next thing that kind of happened after I got the employment thing figured out is, I met my husband. So there's a lot of barriers with sexuality still. I am very lucky in that I never experienced sexual abuse. In case you didn't know, people with disabilities are very, very much more likely to be sexually abused than anyone else in the general population. And so luckily I didn't struggle with that, but I did struggle with the idea that maybe nobody would be able to accept me and love me for who I was because of the way my body looked. Luckily, again, my parents stepped in. My dad said, all men are idiots till they're 25. So don't worry about it right now. And then my mom also said, work on enriching your own life. Work on doing things that are interesting to you. Work on having cool experiences so that by the time you meet the right person, you've done all this amazing stuff rather than just sitting at home wishing that you were dating someone, right? And so those pieces of advice really helped keep me going, and eventually I did meet a really wonderful man. His name is Paul. He's over there. And he doesn't want to be pointed out, but there he is right there. Yay for Paul. We have been together for 12 years now. We got married 5 years ago, and thank you. So the thing is we had to have a lot of conversations about our relationship. At the very beginning. So our relationship is in some ways very unique in that he helps me with a lot of personal care things that most people at this age don't do. But we have a long-term view. If you live long enough and you're married, probably your spouse is going to end up helping you, or you're going to end up helping your spouse. So we just fast-forwarded 45 years, and that's kind of where we are. And it doesn't mean that it's always easy. It takes a lot of communication and give and take, and we're still working on figuring out boundaries, but I think that that's actually sort of true with every relationship, in different ways. And so we also have very normal arguments about socks and normal things that like who left a pair of socks in the bed, for example. And so those kind of things, our relationship is also very normal. And so the fact is that it doesn't seem normal yet in our society. We were worried if people would be judgmental about one person having a disability and the other person not. But in reality, it's not gonna become normal until people see it. And so that's something that everybody can be a pioneer on this front, is by not holding people back when they, and not putting negative messages in their head about love or partnership. Relationships look different for everybody, and the more variety we see, the more accepting we can become, right? And so, unfortunately, when we got married, I had a huge another barrier, which was the benefits barrier, right? So I lost my Social Security. How many of you know that you lose your Social Security if you marry someone who's earning more than minimum wage? It's not widely known, but it's definitely widely practiced. It happens all the time. So I lost my SSI, which I knew was coming. I was aware of that, but I didn't realize how hard it would be to keep healthcare. So I'm from Minnesota, and the situation there is that you can get Medicaid. You just have to pay for it. It's called MAEPD for Employed People with Disabilities. You can only get it if you're working. So there's the first rub, right? We only value people if they're working. We don't allow people who can't work to get married and keep their health care, right? But I was working, so I applied for MAEPT. I did all this paperwork to qualify because I wasn't on SSI. I had to do a lot of extra hoops. I jumped through a million hoops to get onto this one program that would allow me to keep my health care. It's a good program. There's nothing wrong with the program. But what happened is, when I did all the paperwork, I got a phone call. It was 2 weeks after our wedding. I got a phone call from the healthcare office, the county, and they said, well, you don't qualify for any health care. And I was like, what? Yes, I do. I've researched this. I literally called them the day I got engaged to like learn what I would have to do. So like, I was like, yeah, I did all the paperwork you said. I got certified. I did all the stuff that you said. And so this is the program that I should be on. And she said, nope, you don't qualify for anything. And you make too much money, and this is not, you don't qualify for anything. And I said, well, I really think that I do. And she's like, nope, I've checked, you don't. And I was like, okay, well, what should I do then? And she said, well, I would recommend getting a divorce. We had literally been married for 2 weeks, so I'm not the kind of person that usually pulls out a lot of swear words on people. But in that situation, I was very cornered, right? This is the only healthcare program that had been told was available to me, and it was no longer being offered, so I lost it on the phone. I was yelling, I was really upset, and she kind of panicked, and she was reading the paperwork, fine print, and she's like, oh wait, I read it wrong, you do qualify. You qualify for this program. So the reason I tell this story is it's not just because it's ridiculous and we can all see the millions of ways that that's wrong, right? But the other issue is, if I hadn't swore or yelled or freaked out and I just hung the phone up and said, Paul, we need to get a divorce, that's another very plausible thing that could have occurred because of the misinformation. So again, not just talking about barriers, talking about solutions. There are 2 solutions to this kind of situation. The first is, let's be advocates for people with disabilities when it comes to legislation. Why do you have to be poor to be on benefits? Like, I understand that the world is complicated and that we need to work on both sides of the aisle and talk about it, but realistically, the SSI level is lower than the poverty line. Like, that's not acceptable. And the thing is that we can change these numbers. It's not going to be easy. It's probably not going to be as direct as just raising the number. We probably have to do tax credits or something that seems more palatable. But we can work on it. And people in government, people in the agencies, we can be talking about, why are these asset numbers, or why are these income limits and asset limits so incredibly low that you can't even get married, right? That's not really okay. The other thing that we can do is, if you work with people with disabilities, there's the 2 main problems with that conversation is, first of all, she was wrong. She didn't have all the facts, and she told me that she did, and without like checking with the supervisor, asking around. And then when she did have to tell me something that was literally devastating news, right? Instead of being extremely compassionate, which is what you would hope the response would be, like, I have some really bad news for you, I think we need to talk, like, or, you know, like, let's preface this with some compassion, and then tell me that I think you need to get a divorce. That would have been at least a more humane way to go about the conversation. And you guys probably, how many of you do direct phone conversations with people? Like people that you serve? You are so important. And the difference between working with someone like that and someone who is compassionate, I can tell you as a person who has been on the other end of that phone, it means like more than you will ever know to have somebody be compassionate, take the time, like explain things in a way that doesn't come off as rude or condescending. Like, those are very important, very important things. Sometimes it might get lost in the shuffle of what a job like that feels like, because I know it's probably stressful, but you are making a very big difference in the lives of someone with disabilities if you can be respectful and compassionate and right on the phone, right? Those are really important things. So my story does not end there, though. So we got married, and in 2006, 16, I was teaching fiddle lessons full-time, and I entered a contest online. It was the National Public Radio Tiny Desk Contest, and I entered a song of my own writing, and I recorded it on my phone. It was a pretty terrible video quality, actually, but lo and behold, about a month later, I had gotten a call from NPR Music, and I actually won in 2016 the Tiny Desk Contest, which was really exciting. And so that was about 6,000 people entered that contest, so it was a pretty big deal. And so what that did is, obviously it exposed my music to a lot of new ears, which was very neat, but it also allowed me to start talking more publicly about disability issues, and it also allowed me to start touring. So my husband and I realized that if I wanted to try to tour, to play shows all over the country and the world, this would be the obvious time to try. So again, I'm very lucky to have a husband who's willing to think outside the box. And so we decided to sell our house, and we quit our jobs, and we got a van, and we hit the road in 2016. And I've played about 500 shows since then, in 43 states and 7 countries. And the best part of that, and I say this honestly, is I've been able to meet people with disabilities all over the country and even in other countries. And we get to talk about what it's like to live with a disability in our communities, which is not all the same, but you start to see trends. So the reason I brought up these particular barriers in this earlier part of the discussion is because they're everywhere. They're not just in Minnesota, they're in Washington, they're in England, they're in Iceland. These are issues that affect people with disabilities everywhere, and there's things that we can change and work on and prioritize so that people with disabilities can live enriching lives more easily. And so the other thing it's allowed me to do is to think about culture. Disability isn't portrayed in our culture very often, and if it is, a lot of times it's a negative messaging. Not going to get into Me Before You or anything like that, but there's a lot of movies that have really negative messaging about disability, and I think it's really frustrating. So as a person who performs and able to talk about it, I can try to help change the dialogue. And the thing that I want to leave you with today is this concept of disability as diversity. So I really, really get a kick out of meeting little kids with disabilities. I mean, I had a supportive family. My parents were really cool, but like, there's a different vibe. How many of you hang out with little kids with disabilities in your jobs? Okay, because like, there's a lot more pride than I think there ever has been. There's not like the shame that was surrounding just the culture at the time. Like I came out pretty lucky in terms of where I grew up, but I know for sure the generation above me, they had it a lot harder. Like people with disabilities, some of them were still institutionalized as recently as like, oh my gosh, well, like the 90s, 2000s. I mean, it's really not cool. We're making big progress in the way that we treat disability, right? And so this generation coming up is really empowered, and it's been really fun to meet little kids at my shows. But I want them to enter into a world as adults that's not the same world that I entered into. I want there to be a celebration of disability as any kind of diversity, the way we talk about any form of diversity, sexuality, race, like, I just think that we can talk about disability in that way where it takes away the negative stigma, right? And so, part of the reason that disability as diversity is important is because it kind of helps firm up why we need to talk about disability rights. So recently I got a chance to visit the Disability History Museum in New York, and I mean the way that people with disabilities were treated even into like the 90s, in institutions, not allowed to get out of their rooms, like there was a lot of mistreatment and abuse of people with disabilities until very recently. And so the fact that we finally do recognize the disability with the Americans with Disability Act, that disability is a protected class, we can really get behind this idea of diversity needs to be protected and defended and not stomped out, right? So disability culture and people with disabilities can be celebrated for their contributions. And so a broader way to talk about that is the concept of disability pride. How many of you have heard of the term disability pride? Yay! And there's applause for it. That's awesome. Yes, disability pride is the idea that disability is not positive or negative necessarily. It's more of a spectrum. Some of us will be disabled more or less at different points of our lives, and that we don't have to talk about it as like a medical thing, like an issue all the time, like a medical issue that we need to fix. I mean, obviously there are medical components, but a lot of the issues with disability, as I told you, are societal, right? The things that we can work on together to make better. And so disability pride is saying, not only is disability not a negative thing, it's a form of diversity, but not only that, we can be proud of the contributions that people with disabilities make in their societies, of the viewpoints that having a disability brings to your life, the ways that it makes you see the world. And we can start to talk about disability for how awesome it is. The advocates that helped keep healthcare intact, was it 2018 when we had those epic healthcare discussions? Those advocates are some of the coolest people ever. Like, I was so proud of the disability community when they were like getting arrested in their senators' offices. I was like, this is awesome. So, I think we can have pride in the contributions, in the voice, in the way that we speak up, in the way that people with disabilities persevere, but not only persevere, like succeed and do really amazing things. And so having disability pride, even if you don't have a disability, you can help contribute to the concept of disability pride by the language you use around disability. That's the last thing I want to talk about before I close, is that the language around disability is often very slanted, right, towards the negative. She suffers from a disability. She's confined to a wheelchair. He's a victim of a stroke. Those are all words that really come from a specific angle, right? Like the angle is that it would be bad to be in their position. What if we change the dialogue? And I think some of you probably do, right? But it slips in. I mean, all these words are just thrown around in our culture all the time. It's really important to think of how can we talk about disability in a neutral way. I'm not personally in favor of like handy-capable or anything. Like, you don't need to go that far. I like disabled or disability. That's how I talk about it. But I don't need to be the only one involved in this conversation. Let's talk about neutralizing the language. So she has a disability. She uses a wheelchair. He had a stroke, right? Those are all appropriate. They don't have any negative language attached to them. And then the best way is to talk to the people. If you don't know how to talk about something, just ask, how do you want me to refer to your disability? It's like my favorite thing in the world when I do an interview and the person doing the interview asks me what words I prefer that they use. Like, that's really empowering. So we do that with other forms of diversity, I think, pretty often. We're like mindful that we don't always know how to say stuff, so we ask, or we should. And it's the same with disability. I think it's important to say, what do you want me to, how do you want to be referred to, and then respect that person's choice, right? And so language is a way that you can show that disability is something we can be prideful of. We don't have to use negative language around it, and that sometimes because of our disabilities, we actually contribute in unique ways. And so this is how I want to end this discussion with you tonight before I play a little bit of music, is I want to talk about this concept. This conference is about enrichment, right? Enrichment is something that's really, really important to me. So I was lucky enough to be with my grandfather when he was in hospice. He was 94 years old. He definitely wanted to go. He was fine, he was okay with where he was at. He was really, really tired. He just wanted to go, right? So he was in hospice, and we have a humongous family. I have 26 cousins on my mom's side, so a huge family, and 8 aunts and uncles, and it's a very large family. So he was not alone 1 second of his 6 days in hospice. Somebody was sitting with him at every point of the day and the night, and we actually kind of joked that maybe by the end he was wishing for some private time because we were not leaving him alone at all. So every day after work, I would go and I would play my violin for my grandfather. It was something, he was a big fan of hymns. he had hymn sings every Sunday, and so I played all the hymns that I could remember on my violin, and that's what I did every day after work for those 6 days. Well, on the third day, he hadn't talked in a couple of days, and I was playing Amazing Grace for him, and he started moaning, and we were kind of worried that he was in pain, so a nurse came in and she was checking on him, but I decided to keep playing, and while I was playing, she said, "Oh my gosh, he's singing along." And he hadn't talked in 2 days. We weren't even really sure if he was conscious at that point, but he started singing it, and as the song continued, it got louder and stronger, and by the end, he was full out singing Amazing Grace with me. It was really beautiful. It's kind of difficult to talk about, but it was a really beautiful moment, and that was when it hit me that we talk about how all lives matter, and like how we need to enrich everybody's lives, but do we really know that every single person really does benefit from it, whether or not they can communicate that to us, right? And so with my grandfather, it really hit me that every single person can benefit from loving attention and care until the last minute they're alive. So like, we're talking the entire spectrum of the human race. And this touched me because I'm someone who reads a lot of self-help books. I like to work on myself all the time and like you know, set little goals. But eventually I got kind of tired of reading self-help stuff because it became really obvious that they were talking to a specific audience of people who could set a goal, make a plan, go out and do it. Well, if I break my bones, like there goes my plans for like 6 weeks, right? And so I was like, well, I don't want my life to be based around whether or not I can accomplish certain things at any given time, right? Like, I don't want to feel like I don't matter if for some reason I'm not able to like set a goal and do it, right? So this helped me to think about the way that life can be more just about enrichment rather than like setting goals and progress all the time. Like, we talk about progress a lot in our culture. And I mean, I do too, in my own mind, but I have to remind myself that life is more than just progress. So in order to encompass everyone in the world, because I was like, what if we found a measure of success that was like enrichment based so that it could apply to everyone, not just people who are able-bodied and able to get out of bed and set their goals, right? And so I decided if you want to talk about enrichment, there are 2 kinds of enrichment. The first kind of enrichment is the active kind, where we are setting a goal, we want, or we're setting an intention, and we're gonna do it. So we're gonna maybe we're gonna learn a language, we're gonna eat better, we're gonna like read a book, we're gonna sit outside because we enjoy nature. It doesn't have to be always like doing. It can be just doing things that are enriching to us, right? Well, that's still active enrichment because you're in the driver's seat, but there's another kind of enrichment that applies to everyone, which is passive enrichment. So if there's a time in your life or in the life of a loved one where they can't actually set a goal and accomplish the thing, you can help them still appreciate life by doing things that they enjoy with them, or by providing a loving presence, whether or not they can communicate that like the effects of it, right? So after I started thinking about enrichment, I looked up some studies and like learned a little bit about it. And so people with Alzheimer's disease, even if they forgot that you were there, the second you leave the room, if you do something that they used to enjoy with them, studies show that they feel happier for a full 30 minutes, even if they can't tell you why they feel happy. Because like, that's how powerful enrichment is. It goes deep inside. It doesn't have to be verbalized. And there's another story that I think is important to talk about, is that there's a guy named Martin Pistorius. He had meningitis when he was a little kid. He went into a coma for, I believe it was 10 years. But in the second year, he woke up, and nobody knew that he was awake. Like, he was being cared for in the home by nurses, but nobody realized that he was alert, basically, right? And so finally, like 8 years into just like living in his body with nobody realizing that he was aware of all his surroundings, and he was forming sentences in his head, and you know what I mean, he was awake again, a nurse realized that he was, and he was able to use, you know, those devices where you communicate with your eyes, right? And he ended up writing a book about his experience, and he said the hardest part of those 8 years was being treated like he wasn't there. And you can tell the difference between a loving touch and a careless touch, or you know what I mean? You can tell when somebody's just doing the motions or when someone's bringing their full self to the moment. And so whoever we care for in our lives, wherever they are on the spectrum of like what we think of as awareness, compassion still matters, and enrichment is still possible. And so even if, and I hope that is something that you can take with you and think about, and how you can enrich your own life in ways that matter to you, and then how you can bring enrichment to not only the people you work with, but the people that you love in your families and your communities. And so enrichment is a hopeful idea to me, because right now I can set goals and try to do things that I want to do, and luckily I have the support to do a lot of those things, like touring and playing and writing and just like being outside and being with my dog, all these things that I can do. But it gives me hope, because if you are able to find people who care about enrichment, you can actually enjoy life till the very last moment by getting enriching care from others. And that's my hope for myself, and it's my hope for all of you. And so I just really appreciate you having me here, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your conference. I'm going to play just a couple songs for you before dessert. I'm going to let you vote. How many of you want to start with a happy song? How many of you want to start with an angry song? This is the rule. So, raise your hand for happy. Okie dokie. Raise your song for angry. Ooh, angry wins. That's awesome. Okay. Cool. Well, then I know what I'm going to do. So we have time for 2 songs tonight, and this song is my angry song, so thank you for choosing it. It is called I Wait, and it's actually a song I wrote about the disability rights movement in America. So during those healthcare debates, I was very frustrated because I felt like people weren't asking people with disabilities what they cared about for healthcare. You know what I mean? It took like getting arrested in senators' offices to get any attention on the disability community. I would read articles that would list every minority in America about how they'd be affected by Medicaid changes, and then forget to mention people with disabilities at all. Like, they would leave them off of the list of like vulnerable people that would be affected by healthcare change, and it was really frustrating. So I wrote this song. It's called I Wait. It's not about waiting around and doing nothing, but it's about how do you wait in that space when you're fighting for change and you're working for change, but the change hasn't come yet, because that can be a frustrating place to be. So this song is just a reminder that you have to include people with disabilities in all the discussions we have in our society. So here we go. I've been waiting in line. It's been a long time, can't get no service. Still I am hoping for a sign that one day things will change and we can finally take our place. That history won't forget us or try to minimize our pain. And so why wait? And so why wait? Did you know that when I get angry, I breathe fire? I could burn this place down. You may not realize all of the small ways I am not welcome, but just take a look around. Still everybody knows that you need a place to go, and living isn't easy if you incinerate your home. And so why stay? And so why stay? I may seem angry, so please forgive me, but I am still not free in this society. How long must we keep fighting for our right to be living? Wrongs overdue for righting. We're a bit too forgiving. So if you hear them make claims of progress, take a good look and see who isn't there. We need a seat now at the table, so please invite us, or don't pretend to care. Thank you. Thank you so much. So, is the violin on out there? Yeah. Okay, cool. Just making sure you can hear the violin. That would be quite sad. Okay, so the last song I want to do with you is a happy one, because you can't end a conference on a bad note going out to dessert, right? So this tune is called Bird Song, and I need your help to sing it. Don't be scared, it's very easy. So what's gonna happen is I'm gonna set up a loop, and then we're gonna come in together, and we're gonna sing one line together twice, and then you're gonna keep singing the same line again and again and again and again until the end of the song. And if you quit in the middle, it's very awkward at the end. So you really have to keep singing. So I'm going to teach it to you right now. It's very easy. It goes, bird, why do you sing? Fate has clipped your wings. So the words are, bird, why do you sing? Fate has clipped your wings. So that's all the line is. So it's about, I wrote this song early on when I was starting to perform more often and write my own music, but kind of wondering if there would be a glass ceiling because of my disability. Like, would I be able to do all the things that I wanted to do musically? And I wasn't really sure, but I figured I would sing anyways, and that's what this song is about. Even if your body feels limited, your soul is never limited. And so that's the tune, Bird Song. And so we're gonna practice that line together once. The bird, why do you sing? Fate has clipped your wings. So let's try it together, okay? So, bird, why do you sing? Fate has clipped your wings. Pretty good. Let's try it again. Ready? Bird, why do you sing? Fate has clipped your wings. How do you feel? Is Does anyone want one more practice? Everyone's good? Okay, can't really tell. I think you're okay? One more practice? Okay, one more practice. We're getting a request. That's good. Bird, why do you sing? Fate has clipped your wings. That sounded stronger. Good call. One more time was good. So I'm going to set up the loop. We're going to come in together. We're going to sing it twice. And then you're going to keep going, and then we're going to end together. So don't stop singing, okay? This is called Bird Song.
Thank you, folks. Let's all enjoy some dessert ready for us outside now. Thank you very much and have a good evening.